Hi everyone, this is Keena Wolfenstein and you're listening to the Complex Trauma Recovery Podcast. This series of episodes, we are breaking down and exploring different experiential, bottom-up, trauma-informed therapeutic modalities. The goal is to educate people, inform people about different modalities, how they work, and hopefully leave people feeling more empowered to seek out effective and deep therapeutic care. Today, my guest is Sam Robinson. I'm super excited to speak with him. We actually work together. Sam is the owner of the practice that I work at, Strong Roots Psychotherapy, based in Austin, Texas. And we're going to be talking about a modality called Coherence Therapy. So Coherence Therapy is something that Sam introduced me to a few years ago. And when I was introduced to it, it just blew my mind, and it helped make all of these different beliefs and approaches that I already really cared about. It helped make them way more like concrete and clear, where I was like, okay, all these things that I've been, leaning into in my therapy practice, it has this like scientific basis called memory reconsolidation. So I'm just going to give like a little spiel, a little intro to coherence therapy and what some of the different terminology means before I play this interview with Sam. So coherence therapy is based on the neuroscientific research of memory reconsolidation. And memory reconsolidation is the process that happens in the brain which enables deep transformational changes. It is an experiential therapeutic modality, which means it's bottom up. We're really getting into the somatics, the body, we're getting into the emotions, things that are happening in like the limbic system part of the brain. And from that kind of bottom-up perspective, there's these different steps that we follow to help someone shift, transform, and update deeply held core beliefs. One of the things that we're going to be talking about in regards to coherence therapy is the idea of schemas. And schemas are basically the way that we look at the world, and we develop these different schemas based on experiences. So schemas are developed through something called implicit learning. You're going to be hearing me and Sam talk about implicit learning. Implicit learning is when we learn from experiences, not from being taught. So if you read something in a book, that's explicit knowledge, right? Like that's the top parts of your brain that are learning. But when we learn through experience, that's implicit learning. And there's different parts of the brain that hold on to that implicit knowledge. So let's say you have, any kind of traumatic experience, that's going to teach you something. Implicit learning is when an experience teaches you something. And in complex trauma, well, not just in complex trauma, but especially in complex trauma, we develop a bunch of schemas. And schemas have two parts. So part one is what to expect from the world around me. Part two is how do I need to adapt in order to survive that, in order to navigate that and protect myself. So for example, you grow up experiencing emotional neglect. The implicit learning is no one's going to meet my needs. No one cares about me. I'm alone. And then how do I need to adapt to that? And different people are going to adapt in different ways. Some might be, I'm going to be avoidant. I'm going to self-isolate. I'm going to make sure that I never rely on anyone, that I become hyper-independent. Others might instead become people pleasers and caregivers to try to maintain attachment and connection with people. But whatever it is, we're going to see basically, this is what I expect from people. This is what I've learned about the world. And then this is how I am going to adapt to that implicit learning to try to cope with it. So when people come to therapy, the layer that we're seeing a lot of the time is the adaptations, right? People are coming to therapy and they're saying like, I don't like my anxiety. I don't like my avoidance. I don't like my addictive behaviors, different things like that. But those adaptations are just one part of the schema. So we need to understand what is the emotional learning underneath the adaptation. How did you learn that you need to dissociate, numb your emotions, suppress your anger, avoid closeness, whatever those different things are? So those are just some of the kind of foundations for the memory reconsolidation process. And then I'm going to read a little excerpt from Transforming Traumatic Experiences with Memory Reconsolidation by Courtney Armstrong. This is just kind of a paper summarizing what we know about it so far. These are the steps for memory reconsolidation. So step one is to recall the traumatic memory. And I will say that I think these steps kind of can go in different ways depending on the client, but this is a good summary. Recall the traumatic memory. Step two is to explore the implicit beliefs attached to the traumatic event and the client's desired beliefs. So this is what I learned from it, right? These are the beliefs that formed from this experience, and this is what I want to change about that. Step three, create a felt experience that changes the meaning of the event, or what scientists call a mismatch experience. So you guys have probably heard me on the podcast before talk about disconfirmations, or corrective emotional experiences, right? We need actual experiences that can juxtapose and disconfirm these original traumatic experiences. So that's step three. Step four is to describe the event while integrating the client's new felt experience. So basically, we're going to be going back and forth integrating the original learning and the new learning. And then the last step is a new narrative integration, which is kind of repeating the story, revisiting these different experiences until the new meaning feels true. And those words are really important, feels true, because this is not a cognitive model. And I've talked before about how people can experience this dissonance where it's like my brain feels one thing, but my body feels another thing. And so we're looking to actually shift the felt sense, the core beliefs, and the meanings that people have extracted from traumatic experiences. And coherence therapy is a really cool modality because it actually gives the therapist a lot of flexibility to use different techniques. So the memory reconsolidation process can be accomplished with somatic experiencing, IFS, EMDR. Like there's a lot of different therapeutic techniques that can kind of be plugged into this formula, but we need all those steps to be there for memory reconsolidation to happen. And we know memory reconsolidation has happened when a core belief has truly been updated, right? So for all my listeners with complex trauma, instead of you just telling yourself something that you think you should believe, it's when that felt sense actually shifts and you're like, oh, like I get it now. Like I actually feel in my body, you know, that I'm safe or that I'm lovable or that I don't need to respond in the same ways that I've always responded, that kind of thing. So me and Sam are going to be really just kind of breaking down coherence therapy, talking about what it looks like, giving some examples, and I hope that you guys enjoy this episode. All right, I'm super excited for our guest today. I'm going to be interviewing Sam Robinson, and I'm going to read his bio. Sam is an LCSW supervisor and founder of Strong Roots Psychotherapy in Austin, Texas. He was born and raised in the UK and trained as a social worker at the University of Sussex in Brighton. He crossed the pond in 2016 and began his career in child welfare in Kansas City before moving to Austin, Texas in 2018 to work in a group practice and pursue his passion for music, specifically playing the drums. Sam started Strong Roots Psychotherapy in March of 2021. And during that time, he worked with Robin Ticic towards his coherence therapy certification. Coherence therapy and the reconsolidation process have become the focus of Sam's work with clients, and he seeks to deepen his work with continued training and consultation. Sam works with a range of clients, but finds joy in helping folks find deeper meaning in their past and how adaptive ways of coping in childhood are in full force in the present day. Helping clients unlock this and update emotional learnings has become a passion for Sam. Thank you for being here, Sam.
Thank you.
I feel like also I should mention before we start that we work together. So Sam is the owner of the practice that I work at, and actually introduced me to coherence therapy. So
yeah. Thank you for saying that. I should have put that in my bio that you are part of the Strong Roots crew.
Yeah. I figured I should start with that. So I'm really excited to talk about coherence therapy today. When Sam first introduced me to coherence therapy and I started reading about it, I felt like it created this really clear structure for a lot of the kind of ideas and approaches that I was already really drawn towards, but just put it in like a much clearer format. So I think people that have been listening to my podcast for a while will be like, oh, some of this sounds really familiar. But yeah, to start off, can you just speak a little bit about what drew you to coherence therapy and kind of like a synopsis of what it is?
Yeah, for sure. Actually, what you just said kind of rings true for me too. A friend, a colleague of mine had recommended the book by Bruce Ecker and Robin, Unlocking the Emotional Brain, and I read it and I was sort of like, oh wow, like I think I'm doing some of this. But at that point, I was sort of doing I was doing, I was doing kind of deeper work with clients and not really knowing what to do after we get to a certain point. And really reading the methodology and unlocking the emotional brain just gave me the language, and gave me the sort of next steps to sort of not just have people discover deeper meanings from their past, but also how to change it. So yeah, as soon as I read the book, I was like, this is my jam. I think I'm doing a little bit of it already. Obviously, it's harder in practice. So I mean, the training kind of never stops really, but that opened my eyes to it. And then the Coherence Psychology Institute, they do like a scholarship. And in 2020 or end of 2019, I applied for the scholarship. So you get like to work with a certified trainer for almost a year, which was great. So I worked with Robin, and that was it for me. I was like, I drank the Kool-Aid. It was like there was no other therapy methodology out there for me. But actually, in saying that, it works really well with a lot of other like more techniquey type modalities, like IFS or AEDP. The methodology really just guides you to how to take a client to a place, and then how to adjust or change emotional learnings. It's not necessarily like a list of techniques. So that's how I got into it. And essentially it's like, in coherence therapy, you're always listening out to why someone's problem, depression, anxiety, social anxiety, whatever, may actually be a solution to some other problem which is rooted in your past. So something that seems like perhaps maladaptive presently in your life actually probably was adaptive at some point. Like it probably prevented some other suffering, which is kind of implicit and unconscious. So the goal of coherence therapy is to figure out with the client or guide the client to that unconscious learning, make it conscious, and then update it with a more current sort of adaptive way of being. So it's really sort of a non-pathologizing approach where you're not going, okay, well, clinically you're depressed and that means this and that. It's like, oh, actually, maybe the depression is a solution to some other thing in the past that we need to get to.
Yeah, that non-pathologizing has been such a theme with the different modalities that we're talking about. I feel like that's one of those core pieces of like a really good trauma-informed therapy, is that it looks beyond just kind of what's in the DSM and like assigning things as problems. And I can't remember where I heard it, but like years ago, I heard a therapist say adult problems usually begin as childhood solutions. And I was like, oh my gosh, I connect with that so much. So I had been telling that to all my clients and like working from that framework. And then I heard about coherence therapy, and they call it the pro symptom position, right? And it makes so much sense to me. And I think it's like so validating and affirming for clients too, to do that work and to see the ways that their problems have been adaptive.
Yeah, totally. Actually, I forgot to mention, before I did the CT scholarship, there's a wonderful lady in Austin, Tori Olds, and she does a training called Minding the Heart. And she actually opened my eyes to coherence therapy in the first place. And one of the things she says is that, yeah, like you just said, clients come to therapy with their solutions, not their problems.
Yeah.
And it like blew my mind. I was like, oh yeah, like we sit around and we talk about how clients are this type of client and this is their diagnosis and stuff. And I'm like, yeah, but if we view them as coming with their solutions, the work can be so much richer, and understanding how is this a solution for them in their world, like their subjective world. You know what I mean? It was really wonderful to hear that.
Tori Olds has an amazing, I highly recommend her YouTube channel to anyone listening too. She has that great video about memory reconsolidation, kind of breaking down the process. I've learned a lot from her as well.
Yeah, so she's great.
With coherence therapy, it's experiential, and that's the series that I'm doing right now is, trying to break down different experiential modalities. So I've kind of been asking all of my guests this, just because I like hearing the way different people answer it. So what is experiential therapy to you? And what's the difference between experiential therapy and non-experiential therapy?
Oh man, that's a good question. Yeah. I think I'm trying not to use other people's definitions that I've that I've listened to.
Original work only.
Original work yeah, because Tori talks about like mindfulness and being in the moment, you know, the interpersonal in the moment stuff that happens. But I think for me what it means is literally just, instead of having a talk, a chat, like there needs to be an experience that happens for the work to be deep. And you can tell, like, you know, you and I perhaps right now are having a more cognitive in our head chat, because that's the nature of this type of thing. But you really want clients to embody an experience. So instead of like saying, oh, I feel anxious when I'm in a group of people talking about something I'm passionate about, you would have the client imagine that they're in that situation. And they would say, okay, so I'm there and I'm looking around the room and I see the people. And in the moment someone invites me to talk, I'm feeling this warmth, like kind of in present tense, like really trying to embody the experience of the problem in real time rather than talking about it in past tense. And really, like, experiential can just mean, for me, it's like anything that's not in your head. So it could be anything, like it can be just having a client focus on their body, you know, all the somatic stuff is experiential. Setting up a scene where, you know, perhaps a client struggles to do a certain thing and you have them play out them imaginally doing the scene so they can talk about what's happening in their body and why it might be necessary not to do that thing.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it's being in it, in the present, you know, conjuring up like the feelings and the somatic sensations and all of that in like live time instead of kind of reflecting on it from a distance.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's totally it. And in CT they always talk about being in it and speaking from it rather than about it.
Yes.
Which is hard, you know, because everyone has we've all thought about our problems a lot, and we can probably all talk about them all day.
Right.
And I know for me, like being invited to slow down and be in an experience as if it's happening really like shines a light for me on what's happening. And it's such a deeper way of working.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. And I mean, I think a lot of the people that listen to my podcast and a lot of people in general, they've gotten stuck in exactly what you just said, which is just like talking about the problems, thinking about the problems, analyzing the problems, you know? And so this just, I think, especially for the people that kind of identify with like, yeah, I'm really analytical, I'm up in my head a lot, but I can't make those like deeper emotional shifts. This is like a really, really helpful framework for that. I was also thinking of, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to speak to that because I think you'd mentioned something a while ago that I saw about how people can be told, oh, well, you have all the insight now, like I can't really help you anymore.
Yeah.
Or like you, and you know, I get a lot of clients like that too, who are like, yeah, I've been in therapy for however long and I'm not really, nothing's happening, or the therapist has said I know everything. And I think insight doesn't really bring change. You know, it doesn't really experientially shift stuff. It's just like, oh yeah, I've thought about it, I've talked about it, but your nervous system is still wired the same. The implicit knowings are still the same. Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to mention that.
No, thank you. That actually leads perfectly into what I wanted to talk about next, which is so something that was kind of like a question for me for a while was, you know, what is that difference between knowing something in your head and like actually believing it and feeling it? And that's a conflict that I come across a lot, especially earlier in my work when I was still kind of figuring out my modalities with complex trauma, where, you know, people will come in and they'll say like, in my head, I know that what happened wasn't my fault. And like, I was just a kid, but like in my gut, I still feel, you know, all this shame or all this self-blame and guilt and things like that. And, or, you know, or any other belief. And I wasn't quite sure. I was like, what makes it so you actually feel something, like you actually believe something full body and mind instead of this split between like the cognitive and the emotional? And so I think the implicit learning and emotional learning kind of answered that for me. So could you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the example you just gave of like, I know cognitively it wasn't my fault, but in my gut, I feel like it is. I think that's the first place you need to land is this terrible thing happened, and what I learned was it was my fault. And really letting the client sit in that is really uncomfortable. But it sounds like there's also a part that because obviously when there's trauma for kids, the way they make sense of it is like, this is my fault. And I think you have to get to that first discovered bit of material before you can change it. And the changing it in this case may be having the adult self that knows cognitively it's not our fault, meeting with the child part. Do you know what I mean? Like the juxtaposition would be the adult part being the attachment figure to the traumatized child in that case. But in terms of like having someone really feel it, if someone still is saying cognitively, I still believe it, and you've done the discovery work, it probably just means the discovery work wasn't deep enough. So maybe you have to revisit some stuff. Maybe you have to do some more digging. Maybe where you discovered wasn't the right place, or there was some other meaning or bit that was missed. And really, it's up to the client to gauge in their own system on a felt sense, like is what we're doing feel true and true to you? And I think there's sometimes you can kind of gauge it as the therapist, but I think I'm learning more and more to really just trust the client. And if they're coming back and saying the problem still exists and I'm still in my head and all these are still cognitive ideas right now or whatever, I think you need to do some more discovery work, perhaps.
Yeah. I like that question of like, does it feel true? I think I ask my clients that question a lot in our work. Like, what feels true? And especially if clients kind of, they know in their head what the like quote unquote right thing is, or they're like, this is what I should feel, or like, this is what I should think about it. And it's like, yeah, but what actually does like feel true? And I like how you said, we have to kind of like start with, what we know on that deeper emotional gut level and like stay there for longer than you would think, instead of, I think with some more like cognitive therapy models, it's like, okay, you identify the core belief and then you try to like, kind of change it or transform it really quickly. And instead it's like, no, you really got to like fully like feel it out and be in that original truth.
Yeah. And it's less about just staying in the autobiographical memory, right? It's like more about, so this thing happened, and what do you feel it meant about you? What did it mean about the world? Like, what are the things that you learned from this thing that are now guiding how you live your life today, kind of?
Yeah.
And also, there is a sort of needing to stay there for a bit, but obviously if a client is like, you can see that it's really dysregulating, obviously it needs to be done with their consent.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Instead of, because it's really hard, but you're also not just like, walk me through the scene. You're really like, let's milk the scene for meaning. It's less about
not
what
just
happened
the memory
to you. Yeah, it's like what happened that now guides how you live today, which could be it's so unique. You can't really, the list is probably endless.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's like, I think naturally too, as a society, we're wired to be in our heads. So, I mean, I often struggle to know, like, has this been deep enough that the client is saying it feels true? And I think what I do is I just stay and I'm like, oh, what about it feels true to you? Or what about it feels necessary to do? Like, I really just try and stay there. But I think my own needing to speed up or like push a client through the methodology gets in the way, and actually slower is faster, and like not moving on until you and the client are completely in unison about what everything means and how it impacts them. That makes sense.
It totally makes sense. So I want to kind of define a few of the different things that you were talking about here. So one, when we're talking about like, what did you learn about yourself and about the world and about other people? So, and I'm going to kind of give my understanding, and then Sam, feel free to add on here. But basically when we have an experience that is like an intense emotional experience, intense enough that it actually kind of shifts the way that our brains construct an understanding of reality. And I've heard that there are kind of two parts of a schema is kind of the language that I use. The first part is like what to expect from the world around me. And the second part is, what do I need to do to manage that? So if you have like a strong emotional experience of being, chastised or bullied or that kind of thing, and then you kind of think to yourself, okay, I expect other people to like reject me and chastise me. And there's also going to be like a behavioral adaptation that comes from that, which is like, or even like an emotional adaptation, which is like the way that I need to deal with that is, and it could be anything, right? There's not just one example, but like I need to, be closed off and not be vulnerable, or I need to be like tough and, be mean to other people before they can hurt me. Or so that's kind of like just a brief example of what implicit learning is, right? It's learning that happens from a strong emotional experience.
Totally. Yeah. And it doesn't even have to be big T trauma stuff. I'm just thinking about how a young man could just have a memory of being told boys don't cry, and the father saying boys don't cry, don't, whatever that, and the implicit meanings from that could be anything. If I cry, my dad's going to reject me. If I show any emotion or whatever, I'm going to be rejected, I'm going to be alone, which can lead to all kinds of problems in your adult life. Social anxiety, just anxiety, being cut off emotionally. But it all makes coherent sense, because the implicit thing is basically, if I'm emotional, I'm going to be rejected by my dad, and everybody is like my dad.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's like a blanket thing suddenly, even though you're not thinking that in your mind. It's just, I think what you're saying is when there's a high intense emotional thing, I think your brain stores stuff differently, and it becomes implicit. There's the autobiographical memory. Oh yeah, my dad said that, but it didn't impact me. But then when you dig deeper, the meanings they're there, and they're happening in real time in your present life.
Yes. And they're generalized out. Like you said, it doesn't just become like, oh, my dad isn't a safe person to be emotional with. It becomes like the whole world is not safe to be emotional with, which I think
the whole world. It
gets
every
generalized out.
And that's what you're looking for in CT a lot too, is the sort of very black and white, because sometimes it can be hard, it's not always straightforward with any of us. We're all very complicated people, but I think always listening out to sort of blanket statements, like someone may say, oh, I would never do that, or someone might say, oh, that would be so dangerous to do that, and suddenly you're like, oh yeah, there is these little nuggets of blanket statements because of things that you've learned from your past, which is what we're looking to kind of loosen in the work together.
And then the other thing you mentioned was the juxtapositions or the disconfirmations. So can you talk about what that means in CT?
Yeah, for sure. So like you said, when there's like this these implicit learnings from traumatic experience or like an intense experience, they get locked in place, right? So these blanket things of like, if I'm emotional in front of anybody, I'll be rejected, just like I was with dad, right? That's unchangeable, unless actually that's unchangeable despite even having experiences which contradict it. So even if you meet a really emotionally open man, or a partner is encouraging you, they're saying, please be emotional, just express yourself, it's okay. Your internal model is going to be there's no way, way I can't. And so what you have to do in the coherence therapy is get to the original schema, get to that memory, like flesh out all the meanings and stuff, and have the client really soak it up, and sometimes it's enough just for them to say out loud, oh, I had to cut myself off emotionally because I'd be rejected by dad, and I've assumed that everybody is like dad. And sometimes when a client really gets in touch with that emotional truth, that can be enough for the brain to go, well, that's not true, because my wife's not going to reject me, and I have a colleague at work that's always talking about his emotions and no one rejects him. But sometimes if that doesn't happen naturally, you can just ask a client, hey, is there anyone in your life who perhaps wants you to be emotional? Or have you seen anyone be emotional in your life and they haven't been rejected? And they might say yes. And then you guide them between the original schema, I have to be shut off, otherwise I'll be rejected by dad and everybody is the same. And then the new knowledge of, but actually I've seen people do it and they encourage it from me and they don't reject me. And then guiding them back from the old schema to the new knowing. And then that's the memory reconsolidation, which has to happen 3 times. And I think there's a certain window where the brain is like open to that, which is why you sort of integrate it a lot. You spend a lot of time integrating. So for so long you've believed and it's felt true that this has been the way the world works. And now this seems true and you've observed this. So that's the kind of juxtaposition, is like getting to the emotional truth and then guiding the client to become aware of experiences which directly contradict that, which up till this point haven't changed anything.
Right.
That makes sense.
Yes. Yeah. And that's another thing that, I had been speaking about kind of early on in this podcast with trauma, especially with like attachment trauma, any kind of relational trauma, is like you have to have some kind of reparative experience. You have to have some kind of, corrective experience. But I think what the coherence therapy outlines that's so fascinating is like you can have corrective experiences and just not integrate them, so it doesn't actually shift where you're holding those emotional learnings. So it's like this experiential process that allows your brain to actually absorb like, oh, these new experiences that contradict these old experiences, and then allow me to update my my model of the world. It makes a ton of sense.
Totally. And you just can't see, like, because the knowings are so implicit, they're just deeply held truths that you can't contradict by having other experiences until you really unlock what those implicit knowings are. Because we all like have experiences in our life that, and then suddenly they just guide how we live and we don't think about it. And until you do like deeper work, it's not, despite how many contradicting experiences you have, those schemas stay pretty strong. So the goal with the coherence therapy process, or with memory reconsolidation in general, is to produce this thing called transformational change. And I think the concept of the transformational change, in coherence therapy, they compare that to, I think they call it the counteractive change. Can you talk a little bit about those differences? For sure. Yeah. Well, transformational change is really like once you've kind of updated a schema, is that the goal is that the problem that the person came to therapy with, anxiety, depression, whatever it is, disappears. It's once you get to the function of it and do the juxtaposition where the client explicitly feels that the schema is no longer necessary to survive, then the symptom often just disappears. I mean, sometimes it's like a whoa moment, it's like a wow, this is melting away. Often when you watch Bruce or any of the other videos on the CT Institute, there's this kind of magical moment, but sometimes it's more subtle. The client becomes aware of the schema and then they do the juxtaposition, and actually there's not this like aha moment, but they're free from the symptom for the most part. So transformational change is really clients coming in and then leaving without the problem is the aim. And counteractive stuff like CBT and stuff, that definitely has a place. I think it's helpful for some people, although it doesn't get to the root of the problem. And it kind of just you put a band-aid on it for a bit and you can sort of counteract it for the problem for a while, and then the problem comes back. It doesn't do the sort of more deeper lasting change.
And the reason I think that's important for people with complex trauma too is because I think it can feel really overwhelming to think like, oh, I'm gonna have to manage all of these different symptoms and kind of counter them forever. So DBT as well, like I think DBT has some skills that are really helpful for people, but also I've heard many people say like it's kind of tiring to constantly be having to be like, what DBT skill do I need to use to like regulate this feeling, or to like stop myself from having this reaction, or that kind of thing. And so the like deeper relief that comes from like, oh, if we can really reprocess this, you might not have to continually use all these different tools to manage this thing.
Oh my God, just hearing you say that, I feel exhausted.
Yeah.
because and there is also this sort of sense of like, I'm doing this because how I feel is wrong, and what I think is wrong, so I have to counteract it.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I just think it's such a relief to work with people and even have the energy of like, these are your solutions. Now let's get to the bottom of them, rather than, okay, when you think that, just think this instead and remind yourself to think differently. I mean, that is exhausting. And we also all do that all day anyway.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And just to speak to kind of more complex trauma too, is it is the work is longer with people with complex attachment. But Bruce, I'm in a consultation group with him. He's the founder of the methodology and stuff, and he says that the schemas are finite. They do come to an end. Like there is, it's not like I've had a complex childhood and so the implicit schemas are endless. He says there is an end. It may take longer to get to all of them, but there is an end, which was a relief for me. And I have I'm sure it was a relief for other people to hear, because it can feel like, oh, there's no hope, or it's always going to be like this, or it's going to be never ending. And it may take longer for some people, but there is hope.
Yes,
things can be different.
Yeah, I'm sure that would be a relief for a lot of the listeners on this podcast as well. So I kind of want to walk through an example of the different kind of coherence therapy steps, just to make it really clear. I'm wondering how to come up with a good example.
Let me think. I mean, I mean, I can just give you a sort of example.
If you can give an example, and then we can kind of talk through what the process would look like. I think that would be super helpful.
Okay. Let me think. I was thinking I could just use an example of my own me, like being the client. Because I mean, part of the training has been obviously for me to be the client, and I found it really just eye-opening and wonderful, and really makes you when there's a shift, you can kind of chuckle, you can laugh, because for so long you've been living this implicit way. And that's happened to me a few times. So like I have this sort of for a long time, this pattern of like going to shame when I sense that someone is upset with me. Like I would, I could walk in a room, I could see a look on someone's face, and I would kind of go to shame, like, oh, something's wrong with me, I'm bad, and all this stuff. So the therapist I worked with, who was also a trainer too, she was great. She guided me into one of these experiences. So I was explaining, okay, so I walk in a room, I look over at the person's face, and I see that they may be slightly irritated, and my immediate feeling in my gut is like, I've done something wrong, I'm bad, blah, blah, blah. So she just encouraged me to stay there for a bit. And then after a couple of moments, she just asked me what's familiar about that feeling, the feeling in my gut. So she spends time really fleshing it out. She's in the experience with me. And she's like, so I'm watching you there, and like, tell me how you need to go to shame or whatever. We're staying there and talking about the somatics of it. She asked me about what's familiar about that feeling. And obviously in my mind, I'm like, oh yeah, it's my mom. I know the feeling. And then so she'll say, they validate you and all that stuff. And then you go back to maybe a scene that they'll say, tell me what's familiar about it. What images or memories do you have? And I have one of, my mum being in the kitchen, and I can tell she's upset. I can feel the steam bellowing out of her ears, but she's not saying anything. So my default is to go to shame, because I learned when mum's upset, to get the heat off me, I have to go to shame. And everybody is like, mom, right? Was the change bit for me. So once I was in this experience with my mom, and I just want to say too, my mom's a wonderful person. I'm not it wasn't big T trauma stuff with my mom. It was just a pattern that I developed and blanketed to the rest of the world. And so I was in the experience with my mom, and then she actually, the therapist actually had me say stuff directly to my mom imaginally. So I think she would say, tell mom why you need to go to shame. So I'd be in the experience, I'd look over to my mom, and I'd be like, mom, I have to go into a place of shame, because if I don't, you'll reject me even more, or whatever it was. And then she added bits. It was like, and tell mom that what you learned is that everybody is like mom. So I said, mom, blah, 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 this is, and everybody is like you. And when I said that everybody is like you, there was almost an immediate, but not everybody's like you. So then we connect back up. There's a thing called in coherence therapy, which is connecting back up, which means you go and do some discovery, deep work, and then you connect back up to the current problem, which for me was feeling shame when I thought someone was upset. So she connected me back up to that scene. And I would say to that person, which happened to be my wife, Abby, when I see that you're upset, I have to go to shame, because otherwise you'll reject me more, because you're exactly like mom. Obviously saying that made me chuckle, because she's not like my mom.
Right.
So this wasn't over a long period of time either. I think this was one session. And so I laugh, and then we spend time integrating it. We spend time really making sure that what's been discovered is integrated into my consciousness. And then we write there's like at the end of the session, we'd collaborate on a statement, which I read every day. I read the statement, which says, I learned from mom that when she's upset, I have to go to shame in order to avoid being rejected further. And I made this the same for everybody, because everybody is like mom. Okay. And then it was integrating that juxtaposition. And then the next session, it was like, obviously not everybody's like mom.
Yeah.
And the problem didn't exist anymore. The idea was I had to read the statement every time I felt that default to shame experience, which didn't actually come up again.
Wow.
So I read the statement, and it started to feel less and less true, obviously, as the weeks went by. And then the next session was a sort of verification of, for so long, it's felt like I needed to go to shame when someone's upset, because that kept me in relationship to mom. But now I know not everybody is like mom.
Yeah.
And it's okay that people are upset, and it doesn't always have to be about you.
Yeah.
Is that helpful?
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing that. Super, super helpful, I think, to hear the example. And I think so I heard the visualization piece, which is to actually like imagine that you're in the scene, to kind of connect in with the feelings. And then the other thing you talked about was like speaking directly to the significant people instead of about them, where you're actually like imagining mom or imagining your wife and saying these things to them. So what's the point of that in coherence therapy?
It's you're really just aiming to get to what feels the most emotionally true.
Yeah.
And all of those things, sometimes it's not necessary to perhaps say stuff directly to the attachment figure or to whoever is involved, because sometimes clients are already so in it, you don't really need to like deepen into it other than having them speaking from their experience. I think for me, as someone who kind of runs more in my head, I think it's helpful for me to deepen into the experience more by imagining saying this stuff to mom. And also it allows your brain to, Bruce, I don't know if it's Bruce or just neuroscientists in general call it a mismatch detector. So when you're in an experience and you speak an emotional truth to someone and it actually is ridiculous because it doesn't make any sense anymore, your brain will naturally go, that's not true.
Yeah.
So I think there's something about speaking directly to the attachment figure or to whoever that allows your brain to go, oh, hang on a minute, that's not true. Or that is true. That's definitely true. You know? So I think it just helps to deepen in the work. And it's less of because the therapist could have said, so what do you think that meant? What do you think that meant? Or what do you think that meant about your relationship with mom? And then I'm immediately
thinking
in my head.
Yeah.
Whereas she said, tell mom why it's necessary to do that, or tell mom this. And then I'm in the experience again.
Yeah.
So it's about keeping people embodied and experiential.
Yep. Yeah. And I've seen clients before, and I've had this experience myself too, where I'm talking about something or a client is talking about something kind of not connected to the emotion. You can tell there's a disconnect. And then as soon as you add in that element of like the visual or the like, imagine saying this to them directly, tears start coming, and you can just tell that it evokes like such a deeper emotional connection to the material.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And even like, in CT, they use the overt statement, which they call like the workhorse of the whole methodology, which is basically any sort of newly discovered material or like any bit of deeper work, you just have the client say it back to you. Like if
Mhm.
a client says a blanket statement, like, yeah, I have to go to shame because I'll just be rejected. Then you say, wait, could you just say that to me again? You have to go to shame, otherwise you'll be rejected. And then because the client's probably said it in their head, right? And then having them say it back to you
Yeah.
to really deepen into it is really profound for people.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Um, oh, I had another question. What was I gonna ask you about? Hmm. Oh
Mm-hmm.
yeah, okay. So with with the kind of complex trauma stuff, I just wanted to highlight what you said about basically the point that you came to with the example you gave was like, oh, not everyone is like my mom. There's people
Mm-hmm.
that are different. And I just wanted to highlight that because I feel like that ends up being a transformative point for like a lot of different attachment related stuff, because especially with my clients that have complex trauma, you never ever want to invalidate like how real those early attachment wounds were, or again the fact that like the clients adapted in perfectly coherent sensible ways.
Mm-hmm.
But what you do want to do is kind of degeneralize it, where it can be like, yeah, that was awful what happened with mom and dad, or with my family. That was terrible. I really wasn't safe to share my emotions. I really did have
Yeah.
to adapt in all these ways,
Mm-hmm.
but like that's not the whole world. And I find another piece of it is like the helplessness or the powerlessness, because obviously as a
Mm-hmm.
kid you don't have any agency to choose your family or what environment you're in. So even that can be
Mm-hmm.
like a big thing to integrate, I think, for complex trauma, which is like, oh, and I get to choose like who I want to be around, and I can choose relationships with people that don't invalidate me or that don't shame me or that don't whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's definitely not about invalidating. There isn't any flavor of that with CT. Actually, what you do too, which I should have mentioned, is when you get to like an emotional schema, you really like empathize the coherence of it,
Mm-hmm.
empathize with. So you would say, oh, you had to hold in your emotions, because if you didn't, this would happen. You really let the client soak it up, that they literally they had
Yeah.
to do this thing as a way of staying safe. It was so necessary.
Yeah.
Like really, there's nothing about, oh, you did that, well, not everyone's like mom, just don't do it again. It's
Right.
really like you had to. It was a survival thing, because if you didn't, this would have happened.
Yeah.
Really. And I think sometimes some people also, want to speak to juxtapositions quickly, can't
Yeah.
find someone that has treated them any differently, and that's where you can use the client as the person.
Yeah.
Like, so you could have a scene where the client revisits their child self
Mhm.
and says all of the stuff, like, you have to be this way with mom, because if you don't, XYZ is going to happen. And have your client say to their inner child, but I want you to know it's different, and I'm here and I
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah.
And offering them the thing that they didn't get can be really as profound as having someone else treat them differently.
Yeah, yeah. No, I love that you mentioned that, because I mean, I feel like that's definitely something I've found with complex trauma too, is that there can be this like continual reinforcement of the traumatic
I know.
schemas. It's so tough because it's not just like, oh yeah, this one thing happened in my family. It's like it happened in my family, and then it happened in every romantic relationship I've had, and it happened in all my friendships. And I kept experiencing this same pattern over and over again.
I
Um,
know.
it's hard. So we can't be like, oh, just find a juxtaposition, in the relationships you've had necessarily, if someone has really had that just reinforced over and over again.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, it is really unfortunate that happens, but it does happen. And schemas are reinforced over and over again. And it can be really complicated to untangle, but it is possible.
Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah.
also, it's often the presence and the attachment of the therapist can also provide like a juxtaposition. If a client
Yeah.
has talked about, historically, I've never been able to talk about my emotions because I would be rejected by mom, or whatever it is. And really, once they get to that implicit knowing, sharing with them, so what's it like to share this with me now?
Yeah.
Like, is there a sense that I'm going to reject you? I mean, sometimes a lot of people go, well, I'm paying you, and that's
Yeah.
a good argument. But, you know, they're not, you don't also have to be attuned and understanding and empathetic.
Yeah.
So it can help sometimes to be like, and maybe, you know, if they really believe it, oh yeah, you haven't rejected me, and being like, well, maybe, and also maybe I'm not the only person too,
Right.
you know.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the inner child stuff that you mentioned, like I love that. And as my work has kind of evolved, I feel like the main two things that I lean on are the coherence therapy stuff and then like parts work, IFS, inner child stuff. I feel like they just go so well together. And I know in kind of attachment stuff, they talk about how part of healing from attachment trauma is to develop your own internal secure base, like to have that like healthy adult that can internally that can be there for like the wounded inner child parts. And so I just think it's so great that that can also be a juxtaposition. Like it can be the relationship you have with yourself and like with your own parts.
Totally. Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that. Actually, I was watching a demo session of Dick Schwartz, the IFS guy, the other day, and yeah, he's really like encourages different parts to attune to other parts and give them what perhaps they needed, and it's really profound to see the change that can happen from that.
I think it's really amazing. And yeah, so to go back to something you said earlier about the memory reconsolidation process. So basically, you know, my understanding is that the people that were researching like what creates deep change in therapy, what are like the necessary ingredients basically, you know, for someone to experience transformation in therapy. And they found that there were like these key ingredients that were showing up every time, but that it wasn't owned by one specific modality, and that there were like multiple modalities that could accomplish it if they kind of were following the structure.
I think neuroscientists have known about memory reconsolidation since like the 90s, I think.
Oh wow.
Because Bruce's first book came out in like, I think it came out in 95. I don't know, that could be wrong, but he's been doing it for 30 years.
Wow.
And yeah, it is a methodology. Oh man, I was going to say something about that. Yeah, because for so long people thought that the implicit stuff we learned was unchangeable. Once a memory is consolidated, that's it. But then they realized that a memory can be reconsolidated. And so what Bruce did, Bruce Ecker is the guy who founded the whole thing. He and his wife, I think, looked through transcripts of all these sessions where it seemed like change had happened. And then they were like, oh, there's this specific thing that happens. And then they read the neuroscience research and they're like, oh, it's memory reconsolidation. That's what's happening.
Yeah.
And like this, you know, so the steps are like, a client comes in with the problem, a symptom, and then you discover together the roots of that symptom and all the implicit knowings and all of the things they've learned about the world, and you have them stew in that, and then you provide a juxtaposition, or you look for a juxtaposition experience which contradicts the original learning. And then you repeat those steps like I think 3 times. So the steps are pretty clear, and coherence therapy again is like it's a methodology. So you can use it like you can do whatever it takes to get there. You can, like, if you know it doesn't. I think what they do say though is the emotion isn't necessarily the deepest bit. I think the meaning behind the emotion is what's more important for coherence therapy. Like, what does it mean about the world, yourself, others? And you know, because when I first started out, I was always like, oh, I'll get a client to just feel emotionally, and then that's the end.
Yeah.
But actually it can go a lot deeper than that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it seems like the steps can work with a whole range of modalities, which is why it's so great, because I think if you're already practicing sort of deeper work, having this framework in mind just makes you more intentional about how you practice.
When I was reading the coherence therapy handbook, the training manual, there was a part where it said it gave a list of like a bunch of different kinds of therapy that have been able to accomplished the memory reconsolidation, and it was like
Hmm.
EMDR, Gestalt work, schema therapy, IFS, somatic stuff. Like it was just like a big old list, including a few kinds of therapy I had never even heard of before. I think
Hmm.
the ART, the accelerated resolution therapy, the
Hmm.
AEDP. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
really cool how you can kind of like use it in whatever way matches with your own clinical style,
Hmm.
which I
Hmm.
think is great. So I guess to any therapist listening, I totally recommend the trainings. I mean, it's super super helpful. I feel like I got so much out of even just like the super introductory stuff.
Yeah, really recommend it to everybody. I think memory reconsolidation is, it's essentially the mechanism in the brain that transforms people's lives, which I think as therapists we should be familiar with.
Right, that's kind of the
It's
goal, right?
Yeah, and I'm actually disappointed that, I mean, it seems shocking they don't train you about it in school. Like,
I
I know that
know.
there's time constraints where they're like, okay, let's just do all of the solution focused stuff and it's short term, it makes sense. But I wish someone would have said, hey, like the actual mechanism in your brain to help people change is this,
Yeah.
instead of
Yeah.
finding it out 3 years into my career.
No, totally, 100%. It does seem like it's pretty foundational knowledge that we could all use in grad school.
Totally. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I love it.
yeah. Well, I guess I'll just ask a more open-ended question, like with your experience doing coherence therapy, doing more experiential work, what else have you found to be important or impactful, or what's something you love about the work? Just anything else you want to share?
I think really CT is really you don't make any assumptions.
Mm,
You don't interpret anything. For so long, right? You're sort of trained to be an expert in air quotes and an expert in other people's lives. But CT for me, as soon as they said, yeah, don't make any assumptions and don't interpret, I was like, oh my God, thank God. I don't have to
mm,
pretend like I know about this person's inner world, because
yeah.
essentially the client knows, and their subjective experience is just exactly that. And if I
Yeah.
make assumptions, or if I suggest, oh, I think it's about this, it's not gonna it's not gonna help. It may even
Yeah.
hinder the therapy. So really just sitting with, I don't know, but together you and I are going to discover like what this is all
Yeah.
about. That's been so wonderful, and freedom to clarify too. Like as soon as I got rid of this sense of like, oh, I should know, I just clarify with clients all the time. Like, what do you mean by
Mm,
that word? Or what does anxiety specifically mean to you? What
right.
does what does this mean? It's like, and most clients have never really been allowed to flesh out some of the words that they use about their experience. So I've never had a client say, all right, dude, it's anxiety, let's move on. Clients are
Right.
like, oh, I have an opportunity to really flesh out what I mean. Or maybe I don't know what I mean. Or like, maybe it's
Right.
not anxiety, maybe it's this. And I feel like that's helped me, because if I can't move forward unless I'm super clear and understanding and attuned to what the client is saying. If
Yeah.
I move ahead based on my own assumptions, I'm going to get lost. The client's going to feel lost, and I'm going to have to say, do you know what? I feel lost. Can we go back?
Mm-hmm.
Which happens a
Mm-hmm.
lot too, because I'm still learning and developing. I don't think that ever ends.
Yeah.
So that's been really helpful. It takes the pressure off you as like the expert, and you're just the guide. And they talk about sort of taking an anthropological perspective of a client. So you're basically like, yeah, let's dig around together. And
Right.
I'm gonna nudge you and guide you where I can, and I'm gonna clarify, and you're gonna and we're gonna get there together. So that's been
Yeah.
really wonderful.
Yeah, yeah. I love that. I think it definitely honors the whole like, people are experts on their own lived experience thing, like, really putting the client in the position of, your inner world a lot better than I do, and let's try to figure it out together. So I think
Yeah.
it's very like respectful in that way. And then I
Hmm.
also like that I feel like with the assumptions or the kind of like interpretations, it assumes that everyone with the same symptom is going to have the same root underneath it, when
Hmm.
that's so not true. Like you could take
Hmm.
20 people that all present with the same kind of like social anxiety behaviors, and they have totally different like emotional meaning,
Hmm.
underneath
Hmm.
it. And so Yeah. And I find that sometimes people want that simple answer too. They're like, why do I, like, what's the cost for this? Or like, what's the reason for this? And it's like, oh, it just totally depends on each individual. It really is.
Totally. Yeah. I think I was in a consultation once with Bruce, and he said, I think he said something like, "Oh yeah, my advice isn't very good." Someone had asked him about giving advice, and he said, "Yeah, my advice is not very good." Or someone in
Yeah.
the consult had said, "What do you do when someone just wants advice?" And he'll say, "Yeah, my advice isn't very good." And
Yeah.
which is true. If you give someone advice and they go and try it out and it doesn't work out, they're not going. Chances are they won't come back.
Right.
But with the assumption piece too, obviously it's good to like have an idea. Maybe this is about this, but you would never like deliver that to a client. You would set up an experience to test it out.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Like if
Yeah.
you're the client, if you have an idea that the social anxiety is about, being confident means being rejected by someone or whatever, you could
Mm-hmm.
just set up an experience which tests that out. Like
Yeah.
imagine you're confident and you walk in the room and you feel this, the symptom isn't there, and you feel confident and strong. What happens? And obviously there might be like, oh, it feels really great, and then you're like, well, what's uncomfortable about that? They're like, oh yeah, if I'm confident, I'm going to be rejected,
Yeah.
whatever. So it's like you can have assumptions, but you don't deliver them prescriptively. You
Right.
try it out with the client, you find out, and then if you're wrong, you keep digging.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that example you just gave. So that's another coherence therapy technique. That's kind of the symptom deprivation technique, right? And just to give like a quick description, it's basically, you're having someone imagine not having the symptom, whatever the symptom is, and then seeing if they can connect with the parts of them that actually feel like this symptom is necessary for me to have, and it actually feels like risky or threatening in some way to not have it, right?
Yeah, for sure. And it's not just a case of saying, okay, so imagine this exact same scene and you just don't feel it. So what you would do in like a first session of coherence therapy, perhaps you might ask the client, what would you like to be different? And they might say, well, I have this social anxiety, and you flesh out kind of what that experience is. And you would ask them, well, if it was different, how would you feel? And they would say, oh, I'd feel confident, and I would feel grounded, and I'd feel like I know what I'm talking about. So then you would have them walk through the original scene. Oh, so I'm at work, I'm feeling all this pressure in my chest, blah, blah, blah. And then you would offer them the symptom deprivation. So you would say, so imagine that scene now. And the moment before you feel the anxiety, you just are overwhelmed with confidence and you're grounded and you know what you're saying and you deliver this wonderful thing. So instead of just saying, imagine you don't have it,
Right.
you would really try and get them in the experience. And then the moment before that they feel the problem, give them what they would feel instead. And it doesn't always work, but a lot of time people are uncomfortable with being without the symptom, because the symptom protects them from this thing. And then when they if they talk about the discomfort, you just deepen into that. Yeah, part of you really doesn't want to be without this problem, or you empathize with the coherence of it.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
have found that to be really I've done that a lot with people regarding like people pleasing and issues with like boundary setting and stuff like that, where it's like, oh yeah, like imagine, that in this scene that you are able to just say like no, or like, this is my boundary, or assert yourself. And seen that it can, at least with some people, kind of create like an instant connection to that sense of danger from childhood of like, no, that's not safe. And it might not even be like a super verbal thing, right, where there's like a clear words that are coming up, but sometimes it's almost a somatic thing where it's like, oh, I feel like panic in my body when I imagine that, or sensations will come up.
Totally. Yeah. And then you might say, oh, your body knows something about the danger of this.
Yeah.
Like, what does it know, or whatever? It's so, yeah, it's brilliant.
Yeah.
And the wonderful thing is too, is it doesn't have to be this like, okay, come into therapy, I need to know your whole life from the moment you were born until now. It's like you start with the present problem, you do some discovery work, you connect up, and it doesn't have to be, some people come in, they're like, oh, I've talked about my problem so much. It's like, well, this is a different way of doing stuff that doesn't have to be long term. Don't get me wrong, I have long term clients for sure, but it doesn't. The idea is that it's brief,
right,
or briefer. Yeah.
Brief but deep, like a way to kind of like do deep work without it taking forever.
Yeah, I think the first book was called Depth Oriented Brief Therapy, how to
How to
go
go, how to be deep when you were trained to be brief, and vice versa, or something like that.
or how to be brief when you're trying to go deep,
Yeah,
and vice
yeah.
versa. Yeah, yeah, that was the
Yeah.
first book. Yeah.
Yeah, really good stuff.
Yeah, I really recommend. There's some, yeah, like you said, Tori Olds had some really good videos, and there's a guy called Niall Geegan who also outlines like the steps of coherence therapy, which is beneficial for like therapists and for clients too who are interested in it.
Yeah.
Um, and there's also some great stuff on their website, I think, the CT Coherence Therapy Institute.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I think the new book is coming out in January. So there'll be an Unlocking the Emotional Brain part 2, I think,
Mm-hmm.
which is worth
Awesome.
getting.
Yeah. Yeah, I got so
Yeah.
much out of that book. One more thing I wanted to mention, just in terms of like what I see this looking like with complex PTSD a lot, is that, when you're a kid and you're in a traumatic situation, I've talked about this before, but like one of the things that makes it so traumatic is the helplessness and the powerlessness that comes with it. So it's like, yes, the trauma itself, but also it's the fact that you have like no fucking resources when you're a kid, and or such limited resources in terms of how you can protect yourself and like how you can, navigate these situations. And so that has also been like a point of reprocessing that I've seen to be really powerful with the coherence therapy, which is just kind of like, yeah, like I actually have like resources now. I have agency now. I have tools
Mm-hmm.
now. I have different tools, because sometimes those symptoms, and I see this a lot with like addictive behaviors, if it's like binge eating or drugs or some kind of like, substance abuse, self-harm, those kinds of things. The way that the symptom kind of became necessary is it was like, this is the only way that I can like cope with my feelings. Like, I'm
Mm-hmm.
so
Mm-hmm.
overwhelmed and I'm so isolated. This is like the only, relief that I can find. And so then the point of reprocessing is like, I actually have other ways to cope now.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make
Mm-hmm.
sense?
Yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, yeah, that's great. And I was thinking about what you were saying about the helplessness and stuff. And again, like visiting those scenes, the reparative stuff of visiting those scenes as your adult self and being that protector can
Yeah.
really be a juxtaposition. And actually, there's a video that Bruce does where this young lady has stage fright, and it ends up being about this time where she was in a car, um, and her father was drunk, I think, and driving all over the road, and it was really traumatic and terrible. And in the session, the therapist guides her back to that scene. In fact, I think she just naturally goes back there, and he encourages her to replay the scene as if she is empowered and has the strength
Yeah.
to get away. And it really just dissolves this schema for her, because she imagines, getting out the car, phoning the police, being safe,
Mm-hmm.
walking away, being away. But it isn't just like, well, just imagine doing that. It's like really in it,
You're
she's
in it, you're
really,
walking them through it. Yeah, no,
yeah.
I've seen similar really amazing things with, I think I call it like imaginal empowerment or something like that, where it's like, yeah, you go back, but
Mm-hmm.
like this time you have protection, this time you have agency, and maybe it's like the adult you going back to save the little you or
Mm-hmm.
protect the little you, or maybe it's like, oh, imagine you're back in that scene, but there's like a protective bubble around you, so you can tell dad, to leave you alone and stop treating you this way, and that you're safe,
Yeah.
or things like that can
Yeah.
be really amazing.
Oh my God. Yeah. Or you go back there with someone you know and trust now, and you're
Yeah.
both back there. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm,
Really great.
I love it. Yeah, it's so
Mm-hmm.
cool, so cool to
Mm-hmm.
watch, and
Mm-hmm.
especially since a lot of the people that reach out to me for therapy now kind of fall into that camp of like, I'm an intellectualizer. I've been told I'm, too self-aware for therapy. I feel like these different imaginal exercises, just it's so great to watch people be able to like get past that intellectualizing and actually feel some stuff move around.
Yeah. Yeah. And just speaking to that point too, like if a client comes and they're intellectualizing, I think as a CT therapist, you would still be thinking it's emotionally coherent that they're intellectualizing.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
even that has a protective
That's a
quality,
symptom.
and you would work together. If that was getting in the way perhaps of the deeper work, you may work with that as the symptom. Like
Yeah.
why would it be emotionally necessary for this person to stay in their head and be out of their body?
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
would together would discover, that is necessary. So it's never like, oh, this person's just intellectualizing, we can't do the work. This is, you would work with whatever they bring to the session, meet them where they're at,
Yes.
and look at why it may be emotionally necessary that they are that way with everything.
Yeah.
And like, and sometimes I even do it with myself in a session. If I have a session where it's been more of a chat, I think about myself, why was it emotionally necessary for me to just engage in a bit of a chat today or whatever? I'm always, instead of being like, I had a chat today and I couldn't, whatever. It's more like empathizing with the emotional coherence of it. Right. And giving that to clients, I think, is wonderful, because everyone is a perfectly coherent person, and they're coming to therapy with their solutions. And sometimes the symptom, in air quotes, is happening in the session. Like if a client's like, I need to get out of my head, and it's happening in real time, you might try and do a symptom deprivation. Okay, so you want to be in your body. Let's try it right now. What happens if you pay attention to your body, and there may be something uncomfortable about that, and then you deepen into that.
Yeah. No, I love that you brought that up, because I was just thinking about how, because I really like, somatic therapy and nervous system stuff, but I was thinking about how sometimes, if that's like the main lens you're working from, which is to try to get someone like in their body, regulating their nervous system, what do you do when there's like a coherent reason that someone is like totally repelled by that, and doesn't want to do it? And I know a lot of therapists kind of get stuck at that point where it's like, we try to go deeper, we try to get into the body or get into the feelings, and it brings up this like resistance topic. And I just asked my last podcast guest about this too, like, how do we view quote unquote resistance from a more trauma informed, empathetic lens? And I feel like what you're saying is like anything that would be called resistance is also coherent,
definitely. Yeah. And you would never say to someone, you're resistant, but like that's the terminology that we use in therapy, right? Is resistance, but it is it's coherent. And then you would work with the air quotes resistance and be like, why is it emotionally necessary for this to be happening? And also I want to say that like some people are in their heads a lot, and that's a coherent way of being for them. But I think if you're chipping away at why whatever their problem is makes sense on an emotional level, I think any of that is good. And it's good for clients. It's been good for me when I've had sessions and I've been more in my head. If I'm still shining a light on the emotional coherence of my problems, like I still feel like it's effective. And I just think it's maybe it's not always this like deep transformative thing, but if you're shining a light and you're coming from this perspective, it can feel really good.
Yeah.
Helpful.
Yeah. From the IFS framework, I think that would be basically spending time like getting to know the protector parts, which are like our defenses, and really like valuing and honoring what those protections are and what those defenses are, and never trying to just, override them or shame them.
Yeah, I think even in IFS, they invite you to like thank the part. So thanks for being here. Yeah, we've got this covered. Is there anything you need to step aside whilst we do the, and I think any of that stuff is good to get to where you want to go for sure.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having this.
Wait, is it over? I've only just begun. I'm only joking.
I think we're right around the ending mark. But I mean, please, if there's anything else that you wanted to talk about, we still got a few minutes. I'm out of my questions.
No, for sure. I'm just joking. I think it's hard, I'm like, wait, did I explain it properly? Are people like, what the hell is this guy talking about?
No, I think you did a good job. No,
I don't think I have anything else.
Yeah, I think you did great. And, if anyone wants to read more about this, totally like look it up, watch those YouTube videos about it. There's some good stuff online.
Totally. Yeah. And feel free, like people can reach out if they're curious about working in this way. Our website is strongroots.psychotherapy.com. And actually, can I mention about trying to bring people on?
Yeah, I was gonna lead into that, so go ahead.
Oh, sweet. Yeah, so Kina and I are working together to build our team. So we're looking for people who are sort of have been doing some experiential type work and want to do more of it and come and work with us and train with us. And ideally someone is licensed in Texas, but we are broadening to sort of everywhere in the States. So if people listening are interested in getting to know us and maybe wanting to work with us, that would be cool. Feel free to reach out, and you can just go on the website, strongroots.psychotherapy.com, and reach out to us.
Yeah. And I also have my link tree in the podcast episode description, where I have like a Google form where you can fill out an application, or you can reach out to hello@strongrootsPsychotherapy.com. But I figured it was good to have you on, because that way anyone considering, wanting to join can kind of hear how we interact and get like a vibe for kind of what we focus on. So
totally. Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me on.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sam, are you taking clients?
That's a good question. Perhaps in the next couple of weeks I might have some slots opening. But I'm also trying to sort of create space for the new people coming in that we might train and all of that stuff. Mm-hmm. But yeah, if anyone is interested in working through this lens and want to reach out, I'd love to consult with people. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, and cool. I'll put the link in the podcast description. All right. Thank you so much, Sam.
Thank you.